morning. Thank you for joining us for our last series on the Beerline History of the Trail. I'm Darrell Johnson, Executive Director of Burrowes Development Corporation. On behalf of our partners of the Beerline Neighborhood Development Project, welcome to this Zoom meeting. Today, we're talking about the research report recently released from the Urban Institute, Embedding Equity into Placemaking, Examining a Milwaukee Method of Creating Placemaking in Practice. The report focused on the Beerline Neighborhood Development Project and the Milwaukee Night Market, which was held in downtown Milwaukee. The Beerline Trail Neighborhood Development Project began in 2013 and includes a number of collaborating organizations, including Burrowes Development Corporation, Burrowes Business Improvement District, the City of Milwaukee, the Greater Milwaukee Committee, MKE, LAX, LIST, along with Guy and Lynn's resident group, and local advisor, Rails Trail Conservancy, WIBIC, and the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. Milwaukee created the night market on Wisconsin Avenue back in 2014 to showcase local businesses, makers, and artists, and to activate Wisconsin Avenue corridor in the evenings. I'd like to invite Sarah DeLayton, a collaborating partner in the creative placemaking work here in Milwaukee, to introduce Urban Institute researchers and who produced the report. Sarah?
Thank you for that welcome, Darrell. We're so grateful to have this work from the Urban Institute in terms of the research report that we're going to share today. And we welcome Mark Treskon and Kimberly Burrowes to present the findings to us. It's been a long walk last couple of years getting to this point, and the research that we had started prior to the pandemic and all that has followed has led to us having to make some adjustments with how we actually did some of the engagement and found ways to look at both Beerline Trail and West Wisconsin Avenue. But I'm very excited about where we landed and look forward to the discussion today. So to briefly introduce Mark and Kimberly, Mark is a senior research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Community Policy Center at the Urban Institute. His research is on affordable and subsidized housing programs and policies, creative placemaking and equitable community development, regional demographic and economic change, and financial interventions for low-income consumers. And Kimberly is a technical assistance manager in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. Her research focuses on advancing racial equity in parks and public spaces, practices and policies for affordable housing solutions, and participatory engagement. So again, I just want to welcome Mark and Kimberly for all the collaboration. This work I'm hoping will build too from the public safety report that we did with you around creative placemaking and the Beerline Trail. And I just think I wanted to take a moment to just recognize that it's such an important day to be talking about equity and specifically questions of racial justice as we celebrate the life with George Floyd today and this week and all that happened a year ago in our country, that I hope, work like this with creative placemaking can just build from, offer us ways to find peace and connection with each other. So with that, I will turn it back over to Darrell. Or sorry, to Mark and Kimberly. Apologies.
Great. Hi, I'm Mark Treskon. Again, as Sarah mentioned, a senior research associate here at Urban with Kimberly Burrowes. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Darrell, for introducing us. And we're looking forward to this talk. Thanks for everybody we've collaborated with over the last year and a half, approaching 2 years. And again, as Sarah pointed out, we've actually had a longer term engagement with some of you folks on community safety work. So I wanted to share my screen really quickly and kind of give an overview of our report, which we put out on the Milwaukee Method of Creative Placemaking, Investigating the Beerline Trail and the Night Market, which came out last Tuesday. And that we should have a link for that available soon, but it's on Urban's website. But let me go share the screen really quickly. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see the headline at this point. So again, the report title is Embedding Equity in Placemaking. It's an examination of the Milwaukee Method of creative placemaking in practice. And let me get the, okay, great. So what our report does is examining efforts to implement equitable and inclusive creative placemaking approaches in Milwaukee. We looked at the Beerline Trail and the night market and basically how they kind of may align a common approach to creative placemaking and place-based investing in distinct creative placemaking projects across the city and possibly serve as a model elsewhere. What we did is we examined both through a lens of inclusive, community-oriented development. Our goal is helping basically local stakeholders, many of you are on this webinar, basically both more effectively communicate the benefits and effects of placemaking, but I would also say look at some kind of nuts and bolts things to kind of continue your work effectively going forward and help to communicate the value of this work. So what we also do is present process and implementation lessons on how these projects can continue to strengthen equity in the city and region, and also how creative placemaking more generally can help drive this kind of equitable development. So just to start off, what we ended up doing, and I'll talk about our process of our engagement in a second, but really broadly what we wanted to do is divide this project into kind of two sets of research questions, because these are two different kind of sites in two different locations in two different sets of neighborhoods. So question one, we settled on a research question that was focused on the Beerline Trail, and it's basically how the community around the trail is welcoming placemaking, and to what extent are neighbors, whether residents, workers, or visitors, benefiting from the trail's equitable development goals. Our second question is the role the night market has played in spurring development downtown Milwaukee, and to what extent, understanding to the extent that development happening is kind of taking place in an equitable manner. So in terms of the approach and context, I think there's a couple main things we want to kind of get through. Again, the project title is Creative Placemaking and Inclusive Economic Development with support from the Kresge Foundation. As Sarah mentioned earlier, this is building off previous work Urban has done, specifically focused with many of the stakeholders in Milwaukee, including Sarah and those at Riverworks and GMC on the Beerline Trail. And that was an older project funded by Art Place America on creative placemaking and community safety, where we looked at multiple projects that were looking at this kind of creative placemaking from this kind of lens. So that report came out 3 or 4 years ago. I should remember that, but the COVID has thrown off my calendar. But what we did for this project is working in Milwaukee, along with 2 other projects pursuing allied yet distinct creative placemaking projects. And that includes Alameda County's Sheriff's Department and the Brownsville Community Justice Center in New York City. So our reports on those ones will be coming out in the upcoming months, but the Milwaukee report is the first one off the door. Again, I think the engagement for this was really could not be done without our core partners. This includes GMC, MKLAX, Riverworks, and Milwaukee in particular. And I think also the other big thing, which I'll focus on a little bit more, was the data was collected between October 2019 and September 2020. What we ended up doing is with all 3 sites, we had a workshop in Washington, DC to kind of figure out where these various program sites were, and had members from, folks from Milwaukee as well as Alameda and Brownsville to kind of have a discussion, both with people at Urban and other people working in the creative placemaking field to kind of get a sense of what would be useful for them for an engagement for this project. And then after that, we settled on the research questions and then jumped into basically collecting data. And again, our data was mostly collected in 2020, which I will get to it again in a little bit. What we ended up doing for this particular project is we did 15 phone interviews, in addition to our core partner discussions, which we had ongoing throughout the last year and a half. These are with other stakeholders in the neighborhoods and regions to basically get a sense of what was going on. And we also conducted a fair amount of document review, everything from reports, presentations, memos, et cetera, to a media scan and property market analysis. And the other thing I really want to frame is context continued. COVID-19 really threw off this engagement in some ways. It was a big challenge. Observations and analysis before and during what happened basically during the pandemic. Our initial plan was to do an in-person site visit, attend one of the night markets and do some on-the-ground data collection. Same thing with the Beerline Trail. That did not happen. So we had to basically figure out on the fly what would be a useful way to us producing a product and working with all the stakeholders in Milwaukee to put out something that could actually be useful as a tool going forward. So again, the main challenges I would put down to delayed and canceled activities, programs and outreach, that basically not just from the data collection research perspective, but from just literally what was going on in the city over the last year. And again, the data collection plan went from in-person to virtual. That said, I think one thing we want to get out of this, and I think one thing that it's becoming more clear, is this also presented some opportunities for thinking about this work. The pandemic highlighted the importance of inclusive and accessible public space. And I think that's something a lot more people are aware of and have really thought about over the last year and a half in a way that is a good point to discuss these projects right now. And I think this is also an opportunity for both projects to assess where they've been and where they're going. Milwaukee is a dynamic city, and the neighborhoods that these projects are located in are also dynamic neighborhoods, and things don't stand still. So we're at a point coming out of COVID where I think there's a lot of good opportunities for figuring out how they can continue to engage effectively and equitably in this work. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn over to Kimberly, and she'll discuss top-line findings of our Beerline Trail discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. So I can imagine that all the local folks on the call have visited the Beerline Trail before. If you haven't, it needs to be on your to-do list for this weekend. Admittedly, because of COVID, I haven't been able to visit the trail, but have been able to learn a lot of color around the trail, what it looks like, what it provides, from the great stakeholders that we've been connecting with. Well, the Beerline Trail, exactly as the name suggests, is a trail that developed on an abandoned railway that once transported the ingredients of beer to some of Milwaukee's famous breweries. It goes through two neighborhoods, as you can see on the map here, River West and Harambe. River West is located along the west bank of the Milwaukee River on the city's north side, as you can see, and is described as a diverse and economically thriving neighborhood. It's in close proximity to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee campus. Harambe is to the west of the Beerline Trail, and you can see that the extension goes through there as well, and it's a predominantly Black residential population, which historically has had less economic opportunities than some of their neighbors in River West. Due to the transportation network and the way in which those communities have been planned, there's somewhat of a disconnect to certain services historically. And that's one of the things that the Beerline Trail has been trying to address. So I learned recently in doing research for this report that Harambe means all pulled together, which is a great description for the collective impact and identity of belonging that the residents strive for in their backyard. And this project provides a great example of that. So the map that you see in front of you, it demonstrates the stark differences in the housing market between these two neighborhoods. If you see here over at River West, there are more sales and at much higher prices. We also found that there were higher owner occupancies. That's not shown on this map, but part of our research. Now, this could pique some concerns for displacement and gentrification as we talk about the area rapidly changing. Oftentimes, when we look at creative placemaking research, public space investments, we see that there's that unintended consequence of pricing people out. And so that really demonstrates how critical it is to mitigate some of these challenges up front and trying to recognize where an investment like the Beerline Trail, like other creative placemaking activities, can really ensure that they're rooting people in place, and so that they don't get priced out as redevelopment and new investments come into the space, but instead can thrive and benefit from them. Next slide, please. So just wanted to show you some photos of before and after so that you can get a feel of what the space looks like. So this greening process has really gone from vacant to vibrant, and I want to acknowledge that it really took time and significant investment, both from the city and from the stakeholders that we were partnering with. And so just want to show you the Google Street View of what once was and what now is. So this is a photo of the street, July 2007. Next slide, please. And also acknowledging that this is the north section of the trail. So you can see 2014, there are more sidewalks, it's more of a greening process that you see happening. The street looks like a place that you'd be okay walking on, right? You can see the difference. Next slide, please. And then we fast forward to 2 years ago. If we look at September and we can see significant greening happening, you can see more pedestrian walkways, you can see street lights, and just general more vibrancy in the space. And as I mentioned, this is the north side. So next slide, please. I'm going to show you what the south side looks like. So in 2007, doesn't necessarily look like a place that screams, come and hang out, right? If you take a look at these photos. And the next slide. And then you fast forward to 2 years ago, and once again, very similar to the north section, you just see this immense greening process happening. You can see additional street lights. You start to see color. You start to see where there are murals, there's activity in the space. And this is sort of just a quick snapshot of understanding how that process occurred and how long it occurred. And I really want to underscore the importance of highlighting the community's priorities in this process. It wasn't just the city saying, hey, we want to do this, we think it would look great. It was a process that really engaged the community from the beginning. Next slide, please. So dipping into this community engagement effort that I'm describing here, wanted to recognize that in 2016, the city of Milwaukee, they'd engaged in a contract with Hood Design Studio, which is based in Oakland, California. And they are an urban planning firm, and they came in to reimagine what that space looks like. So you saw what it was in 2007, and you see what it is now, and even looking at what the plans are for the future activation of the space. This is something that Hood Design was a convener at the table for. So they were able to hold design charrettes and community surveys and just really bring folks to the table so you could understand what they were most interested in and what they needed. So that this wasn't going to be the creation of a public space effort that just sat and was only used by visitors. It was a destination that folks had in their backyard, that people felt like, I can go out and I can use this space and it reflects what I need. And so this image that you see here is a Lifeways plan that was developed through the design charrettes and through the surveys that were done by Hood Design. And it's basically a plan that looks at the goals of the space and aligns them with the resident priorities. So it offers what the next steps look like for the greening and the vibrancy and the welcoming nature that this asset can provide for those communities. And as you saw in the earlier diagrams, the earlier maps, there's a stark difference between the two communities that the Beerline runs through, and truly an opportunity here to be that glue between the neighborhood priorities and ensuring that folks can feel welcome in their space and can become the core users of the space. Next slide, please. So as Mark had described, we wanted to find out the effect of creative placemaking on these local development projects, and we wanted to understand equity and safety around the Beerline. And we also wanted to look at how best can Harambe and River West start to break down some of the disparities happening there and use this type of project to catalyze something like equity. And we had quite a few findings coming out of our study. And it was just interesting to do this at the time of the pandemic when we really saw the heightened need for public space. So unsurprisingly, trail use increased during the pandemic. The graph over here on the right, you can see those 2020 numbers are really high. And that's because, I mean, you had nowhere else to go. Indoors wasn't really an option. So the activities all became outdoor ventures. And so you saw quite a few people come in and utilizing the outdoor space. And we don't have the numbers here for 2021, but the trail count continues to increase. So you see this appreciation of public space and really something that we can hone in on as we're building outside of the pandemic and we're seeing that appreciation stick. So some of the other findings that we saw coming up from the study, there was a tremendous amount of stakeholder engagement activities. We spoke about the Hood Design Studios, we spoke about the city's efforts, and a lot of these happened especially at the beginning of the visioning process. Those were some of the activities that helped determine how to activate the space, how to align it with priorities of residents. And admittedly so, some of these activities waned during the implementation of this activation. And that's just because as you move along the process, you start to see where you need to zone in on very specific activities along the trail. That being said, some of the stakeholders felt like they were a little bit out of the loop. When we were speaking with our interviewees, we learned that some of the residents that were living close to the trail weren't avid users, which suggested that additional outreach might be needed to encourage them to utilize the space. So this also brings in a wider topic here about the use of public space, because there's more to access than just physical access. It's not just build and they will come. There's also another piece here about people feeling like that asset is for them. And whereas many folks felt like the asset was for them, there were a few that still weren't fully bought into the process, which really demonstrates this need for ongoing outreach. Also mentioning that since the trail opened, there have been several efforts to improve the public space. You saw those 2007 diagrams, and that really was not a place that you would necessarily feel comfortable in for long periods of time. And so there were many efforts to improve the lighting, installation of cameras, removal of graffiti, and programming of the vacant space, as well as the greening. Riverworks Development Corporation also does safety audits to ensure the space is seen as a public asset and it feels welcoming. And that being said, even thinking about the graffiti, we saw that there was a shift in the perception of graffiti. So it wasn't graffiti as something that is unwelcoming, something that's scary. And instead, there was this huge effort to encourage artistic graffiti. So graffiti that pulls people into a space, which was something that was a different perception than before. And as we think about moving this from a pilot project into something that's a more permanent asset, we all think about the principles of tactical urbanism. Especially during the pandemic, we're seeing that some of these temporary structures have a role in being permanent in the community and continue to drive some of these efforts. Equity, as I mentioned, is more than just a physical access. The stakeholders that we spoke with, they shared that they want to see the Beerline Trail as a destination, and they want to see multiple access points for different users, and they want to see it continue to be programmed both passively and actively to harness this potential that it has to bring people together. A lot of that's already occurring, and you'll see that in the design plans for the future, there's a lot more planned too. I mentioned earlier that outreach is something that's really critical. It remains a challenge, especially in COVID, as you have to continue re-engaging folks that may have felt out of the loop, or they may have moved out of the area, moved back into the area. Different things are occurring. But this is still a great asset as long as the residents see themselves in its development and use. And then finally, I'll mention that funding. Funding is always something that we want to talk about here. Having additional resources for ongoing outreach, staffing, and capacity building really needed to empower people to participate in the process. And there's always that balance whenever we think about parks and public space between the funding of the capital development, so the building of the trail itself, and the operations and maintenance, ensuring that it continues to be a space that people want to go to. It's continually a clean space, an activated space. The latter is always harder to cobble together funding for, but immensely critical when driving equity in the communities. And these are some of the things that we saw really stood out when we were doing the project and talking to folks in highlighting what they're most interested in. Now I'm going to pass back over to you, Mark, to talk about our other project.
Thank you, Kimberly. So I wanted to go through the Milwaukee night market, which, the process for engagement was relatively similar to what we did with the Beerline. So we talked with stakeholders, did some analysis, and kind of dug into things. So what we want to do is focus on the night market and its kind of role and part of the revitalization of Westown. And on some levels, this is with multiple kind of broad project goals. This is getting people back to the neighborhood. The picture on the right, I don't have the exact date, sometime in the 80s when the Grand Avenue Mall was happening. And getting people back to the neighborhood. I mean, Milwaukee was one of many cities around the country. I'm from Green Bay, which also had a mall developed downtown that took out many of the old historic buildings and was very popular for about a decade or two. When it fell on hard times, it was difficult to figure out what to do with the land use of that area. And the Grand Avenue Mall and the Avenue more generally really fell on hard times after the 1980s for a number of reasons. And so basically, when we're talking about the early 2010s, there's both a perceptual issue. Basically, people thought the area was kind of moribund, not particularly safe, nothing was going on, and also just figuring out a way to get people back to the neighborhood. Urban neighborhoods and neighborhoods generally are livelier, people are around. So we're talking about basically breaking a vicious circle and creating a more virtuous feedback loop. And so when we were talking to our core group as well as the other stakeholders, I think a really big part of the night market goal was a way to trying to figure out something that would build an inclusive and welcoming event that would bring people back to the neighborhood. Again, in terms of neighborhood context, what you see is Westown was a neighborhood that was sort of on the cusp of change by the mid-2010s. There was growing commercial and residential interest. The map at the right is a hotspot analysis basically showing where there's multiple commercial sales going on. And you see Westown was not much going on in the early 2010s, but by the second half of the decade, there was a lot more going on in the neighborhood. And you see where the night market on West Wisconsin was, you just see more commercial development happening. You're also seeing a transformation of a neighborhood that historically had very few residential neighborhoods to increasing residential permits. I think in the early 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, I think there were single-digit residential sales, and by the last 5 years of the 2015-2019, this is in our report, but I don't have it handy, I think it was 128 residential sales. So you actually see a neighborhood that increasingly is actually getting more residential buildings as well and becoming a more mixed-use community in a way that it used to not be as much. So we're seeing the night market taking place in a neighborhood that was west of kind of the more hopping, already developed, I would say East Downtown neighborhood, and then trying to figure out how to fit into that context and make Westown part of something different. So what we ended up finding is there was a lot of similarities, and I think in terms of the dynamics of what Milwaukee and other stakeholders focused on the night market did as what happened at the Beerline. There was a big attempt to build basically a very inclusive planning process to really dig into stakeholders. And that was something we saw where basically the stakeholders and Milwaukee worked with other folks, basically residents, businesses, real estate interests, to understand what would actually work and draw people downtown. What we have found is really the night market has really brought in people from around the city and the region to a neighborhood and actually had them have fun there. It's also created a really diverse public event in a welcoming space. I think both in our key core stakeholder group as well as other people we interviewed, I think it was something that really came up that the night market was something that has brought people down and really brought a broad cohort of people around from around the city and region. I mean, I think, as other research that I think many of you are all familiar with, Milwaukee is a very highly racially segregated city in a lot of ways. And there's not a lot of places where people of different backgrounds and different races come together and share a space. And the night market has been really successful at that. And that's taken a lot of really active concerted work in terms of outreach and programming to create a space that actually creates that. So I think what we want to dig into a little bit is basically also realize the night market is also one part of a broader change in the neighborhood as well. And it's helped catalyze and kind of push people thinking about the neighborhood in a different way. And that can be an arts place and kind of an arts informed neighborhood that's being created. So we have the night market and creating this kind of event space. And there's also the development of River Rhythms and the Symphony Center moving down to the neighborhood as well. So it's part of these other changes that are actually creating a broader space in the neighborhood, as well as the Avenue Mall being reconceived and thought about as a way to kind of, not just a shopping mall, but the food market, which is still kind of being wrapped up. And creating a different kind of environment going forward. So I think it really sticks out, I think from our sake on it, in particular, COVID gave this a good time to pause because you have a neighborhood that's actually changing in a lot of ways. And so I think going forward, the night market has been a good example of showing how an inclusive space can be created and an inclusive event can be created that really brings people together and gets people from across the region from different backgrounds to think about the place differently and share the space together, which is really important. And it's, increased positive perceptions and really maintained a good sense of place for the area. I think as the neighborhood might change and there might be more development pressures, I think maintaining that space as a gathering spot for the city and region and a diverse and inclusive one is going to be really important. And I think we're at a good point in the, where we're at coming out of COVID to really kind of make sure that it still continues to play that role in the years ahead. Okay, I know we're running a little bit long on this, so I want to go through the takeaways and next steps really quickly. I'm going to take a couple because some of these we can discuss in the Q&A as well, and then I'll let Kimberly take the last three. So, as was pointed out previously with Kimberly pointed out with the Beerline, and I think this is also very important for the night market, funding ongoing data collection analysis is key. You want to get a sense of not only the participants and the users of these spaces, but also the people in the surrounding neighborhoods. Getting a sense of who's involved, why they're participating, why they're not participating. There's a range of things we can do. We talk about some of that in our report. And this can be anything from user surveys to, the counter you were able to use for the Beerline Trail to get a sense of like basic usership. But that's really important to kind of showing what the effects of these places and communicating the effects of these interventions to potential stakeholders and potential funders. And again, I also want to stress that an inflection point of change and opportunity can kind of go in two different ways. An economic success might be showing up that might actually displace or drive out people if equity isn't really included in the design and implementation of efforts. So that's something that I think going forward, it's going to be really important to continue monitoring both, property analysis, what we showed with some of the maps earlier, but also just working with residents in neighborhoods just to get a sense of what's going on and their perceptions of things is really important. And I'll pass over to Kimberly for the last couple.
Thanks, Mark. And so, of course, like as we both described, design is really important. There are physical barriers that can be created based on the use of space or transit corridors. So the history of Milwaukee, as well as several other cities, really demonstrates that streetways have been used as a racialized divider, cutting off services from predominantly Black and lower income communities. And so these efforts provide an opportunity for us to change that. We saw where the Beerline Trail connects people from different diverse communities to services. Right now, there's still some work to be done because there are two segments of the trail, but already we're seeing the use increase in the past year and a half. Similarly, for the night market, we see that they transform these long downtown blocks into a more welcoming space and connect folks to other events like River Rhythms, where folks may not have naturally seen the pathway between those two events. And then another key takeaway here about design is really that stewardship is critical in the process. So having the placemaking organizations, community members, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color at the table are really needed to ensure that the existing residents are not priced out or displaced as this neighborhood change begins to occur. As Mark had mentioned, we're really at this inflection point, and that's where equity can be a driver, or it can also create some unintended consequences. And so really trying to ensure that that stewardship is being built in so that those long-term residents are not being left out of the process. Already, we're seeing a lot of investment from local organizations, Running Rebels, Bader Foundation, Greater Milwaukee Foundation. They've all located close to the Beerline Trail. And there's a lot of attention downtown. So there's just this need to ensure that people don't get driven out, and these projects remain to be catalysts for welcoming space for those long-time residents. And then finally, I'll just end on something that we all know, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. It offers an opportunity to reinforce the value of placemaking activities and to create spaces for communities while people are distancing. We saw this through this project and across the nation where there are all of these opportunities bubbling up. And so I'm really excited for you all to take a look at the paper and some of the findings that we've been able to tease out further there, so that you can all get ideas for Milwaukee as well as other cities that are trying to think more critically about utilizing your creative placemaking projects. And with that, thank you.
Well, thank you both, Kimberly and Mark. When you started this report, I know we had no idea what the challenges were going to be related to COVID, but I want to thank you, all of us involved, want to thank you for your persistence and your innovation in conducting these interviews and research when there was no site visits possible due to COVID. Now I'd like to introduce Rosalind, who will moderate the panel discussion for us. Rosalind?
Good afternoon. Thank you all. Is this good afternoon? Yes, afternoon now. I am Rosalind. I am with Riverworks, and I'm happy to be here. This is our last one, so it's very sweet. Thank you to Mark and Kimberly. We super appreciate your work on the report and listening to our feedback that came. And then Daryl and Sarah, thank you all for bringing us in. I'd like to introduce Angela Damiani, is the CEO and co-founder of Milwaukee. Sam Leichling, the city planning manager of the city of Milwaukee, and has been working with us on the Beerline Trail significantly. So I appreciate, Sam, all your work on this. And John Kissinger is the president and CEO of Grace. So before we begin our conversation, just note if there are any audience members that have any questions, please use the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get those answered at the end. Before we start, I just want to say, Kimberly, thank you for showing the before and after pictures, because oftentimes you don't realize what you're doing because you're in the process. And so seeing those was like, oh, okay, there has been change. So I appreciate it. And with that, our first question actually goes to either you or Mark. So first question is, your report includes specific takeaways which create somewhat of a to-do list for both the Beerline and Milwaukee around creative placemaking in Milwaukee. For you all, what were the biggest opportunities and or challenges for these two unique projects?
I can kick it off and then I'll hand over to Mark for some reflections. Well, I would say that the biggest opportunity is that Milwaukee has this diverse pool of stakeholders. Just looking at this panel alone, it's really demonstrative of such a tight-knit and intentional group of folks that care about creative placemaking and care about using creative placemaking to drive equity and produce community value. So I think it was just immensely important to have city departments at the table. So you have the public sector, you have the community organizations, you have the local foundations, anchor groups like the library and the symphony, and they're all invested in these solutions. So that's really a important opportunity to underscore for being able to take some of these next steps into fruition. And I'd say really quickly, I think the big challenge here is measuring equity is not only difficult, but it's something that has to be very intentional and it can take time. So it's something where if we're thinking about measuring equity for public space projects, you can't really divorce what's happening and other priorities that are happening on the ground, other funding streams, other community interests, when you're taking a critical eye towards something like the Beerline Trail or the night market. And so that means that some of the work that you're doing might entail some trial and error. And so I really encourage things like the constant feedback loop to try and mitigate some of those challenges.
Thank you. Anything, Mark?
Sure. Yeah, I think, I mean, Kimberly's points, I think, are straight on. I mean, I feel that related to that, challenges, I think resources are always a challenge. I mean, we're researchers, so we come to this from a data collection perspective. That obviously things take time. I mean, user surveys can be complicated to pull off, but they can be really useful. And neighborhood surveys are much more complicated and quite often take a lot of resources, but they can be really useful. So that's just one thing that is important. I mean, I think the other thing that's really come out here, but has also come out with creative placemaking and work on kind of civic commons work, which kind of relates to this, I think across the country, is that the resources are really important to make sure space is back. And that means, as I think we pointed out at the end, it's not just the physical space, because quite often you have a physical thing that comes up, you have a ribbon cutting and it looks nice. And not only does it just need to be kept up over the years to make sure like lawns are mowed and welcoming, but you need a reason for people to come to. And that makes space activation really important. And just creating a physical thing and plopping it down and expecting people will come is not really necessarily going to work, but making sure it's activated and continues being vital is brilliant. And I think the other thing that's related to that, both of these projects have really done a really strong job of that, and I feel that's the core linkage of this sort of Milwaukee Method placemaking that we kind of started this whole project with, was the importance of basically figuring out ways to build inclusive. That's you can have on some levels, you can have kind of inclusion bias when you have just too many reports or too many meetings over time and people just check out after a little bit. But it's still really important to keep open those channels of communication and make sure that you're reaching out to the stakeholders who you know about, but also that you continue to not the stakeholders, but still the stakeholders. So I feel that's something you've all been really intentional about doing. And that work, as we learned with COVID, even putting it on sort of a temporary pause can actually start making people feel like they're less on. So that's just, I think that just highlighted how important this kind of.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Ms. Angela, I am coming to you. So 2020 was 2020. That was a challenge for everybody, but your organization especially, who focus on bringing people together. So as the night market has opportunity to restart, how will the experience of 2020 and this report inform your work as you move forward?
Thank you for that. Yeah, in a lot of ways, when I think about the original call to action to activate West Wisconsin Avenue, I feel like we're kind of back at square one, right? Like most central business districts, downtown has really been devoid of life, right? The normal people who would be traversing those sidewalks, from 9 to 5 have all been sheltering in place or working from home. or perhaps, in some sort of hybrid reality. And so from that perspective, I feel like we need something like the night market to sort of reignite downtown in a way, and bring workers back, you know what I mean? And motivate them to like leave their home offices and want to come back, feel safe coming back together. As we continue to be more vaccinated, it becomes more safe to do so. The second element of it is, even though we canceled in 2020 and we have not yet declared plans for 2021, we are contacted on a daily basis by the artisans, the makers, the small business owners who quite frankly need a market, right? The market was a big part of how they sold their wares and were able to perform their own commerce. And so that level of activation is still really needed for the micro enterprises that exist in our community, and quite frankly, do not have the normal brick and mortar, or perhaps even had brick and mortar and have had to sunset that because COVID has sort of hit Main Street in a really hard way. And so for me, it feels like reading the results of the report were further validation of what we were instinctively seeing as like, perhaps this is a solution once again for regalvanizing our downtown area as we come out of this.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Mr. Johnson, haven't seen you in a while. That's a joke because I worked with him. So one of the takeaways for the Beerline Trail was to ensure community engagement, which is especially a sensitive place for me. So with the pandemic and changing how we had to engage, how is the project now being very intentional on engaging the community?
Well, thank you, Rosalind. For some reason, I guess you got tired of looking at me, so you can't see me because I can't turn my camera back on. But somebody has blocked me out. They don't want to see me anymore. But one of the things that we really have focused on as an organization is really outreaching to the community. And we have done that through what we call the Guiding Lens, which is made up of residents from Riverwest and Harambe, and also the business community within the Riverwest Business Improvement District. So it cuts through three areas, and the Business Improvement District is a key partner in helping us not only leverage resources, but leverage the workers within our community. Because we are what we call Milwaukee's creative district. So we have a lot of creative individuals, and they can bring that talent to the trail. So what we're trying to be not only inclusive with the residents, but also with the businesses in the area. And so through this Guiding Lens group, I think this is our major outreach piece that will bring residents not only onto the trail, but bring them as we develop ideals and programming for the trail.
Perfect, thank you. And Sam, all right. The city has been an integral partner of the Beerline. Your presence has meant a lot for us as we move through this whole process. How does the Beerline Trail fit into the city's overall development plan?
Wow, well, great. Thanks, Rosalind, and thanks to the rest of the panel. I mean, I think the Beerline represents the city's goals, both in our planning and development goals and across a number of things. I think it ties directly to our development plans as it relates to recreational opportunities, economic and community development, as well as creative placemaking. And I'll just talk briefly about all three of those things. I think one of the long-term goals we have as a city, and this was, I think, initially put to paper in the city's environmental sustainability plan, but it ties to much of what we do, is that all residents should live within a 10-minute walk of a recreational amenity. So that's the North Star goal we're looking for. And by improving the Beerline Trail, making it a true recreational amenity, it helps us achieve that goal. It helps us connect residents of the Harambe neighborhood to the larger route of the Badger, regional trail network, as well as reducing disparities in access to recreational amenities and supporting health equity. So it's directly aligns with our recreational goals. It also aligns with our goals around economic and community development. You and Daryl are as familiar with anyone as the centerpiece that Riverworks is as the creative district for the near north side. And we at the Department of City Development worked with Riverworks and other partners a few years ago to develop the Riverworks Strategic Action Plan. And I thought that was a really innovative plan at the time because it talked about using the Beerline Trail to spur economic development in that kind of small maker and creative industry. So many other cities, I think, are doing similar projects that are more around, housing development. And then that brings up all the issues we heard from our colleagues at the Urban Institute about gentrification. But in Riverworks, your focus has always been around using the trail to really improve the creative business district. I think that's unique. And I think that is, directly aligned with, things the city wants to support related to economic and community development. I don't want to minimize housing. We're certainly focused on also using the trail to kind of tie together our complementary investments in housing along the trail, whether it's our work with our partners to focus new home construction with Habitat for Humanity or housing rehabilitation through our strong neighborhoods resources all along the trail, and just saying, those investments need to complement each other and be focused on supporting existing residents in allowing them to see the trail and to benefit from the trail. And then the final area where I think it really ties into the city's overall plans is creative placemaking. You heard others talk about the Milwaukee Method. I won't reemphasize that, but the city's made a commitment to say, when we have neighborhood partners who want to authentically engage in the Milwaukee Method of creative placemaking, we're going to be there and we're going to support it. And we're going to support it through financial resources, staff support, and anything else that we can do at the city. And one thing that I think, one little note on that, and then I'll leave it for ways we've done that with the Beerline, is, many of the audience are probably familiar with the city's community improvement program project grants, where we provide matching grants to neighbors that are taking on, whether it's public space or beautification projects in their neighborhood. And I went back and counted. I think we've done more than 7 of those projects in the Beerline just in the last 2 years alone. So I think it's just further emphasizes that we want to be there as a support role. We know that the Milwaukee Method relies on neighborhood leadership, and the city's job is to support it and then kind of put those resources behind it. And we've done our best to do that on the Beerline and look forward to continue to do that.
Rosalind, you're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Sam. One of Kimberly's slides showed a map, and the first slide she showed of the River West and Harambe area, and what was striking is the green space that was present. So your commitment to having people be, no more than 10 minutes from a vacation space is fantastic, because you see that how the dynamic plays in both neighborhoods. So thank you. John, I am coming over to you. Thank you for being here with us. So my question for you is, the night market helped bring new activation to West Wisconsin Avenue. How did this renewed focus inform your decision to relocate your offices to downtown? And do you anticipate that others will follow with this renewed interest in the space?
Yeah, well, thank you, Rosalind. And thanks everybody for having me here today. Excuse me. The night market, my firm was involved in the night market from the beginning. And we were out on the west side, 5 miles away from downtown, and never at that time really anticipated being anywhere near it. But we just thought it was a unique idea. It took us a few years to find our footing where we fit into the night market, but we ended up having one of the more popular attractions of the night market with our Grafe Lounge and the s'mores we make. And it's always very attractive every time the night market happens, and we miss it greatly. But clearly, yeah, I think the night market had a substantial effect on our viewing and our employees' viewing of Westown as a safe place, a happening place, not a moribund or somebody, not just a dead zone. The fact that our people were familiar with the night market and familiar with Westown, I think definitely happened, and definitely helped our decision to move down to the avenue. And it's kind of ironic that we had hoped to have the night market literally right in front of our front door, the nexus of the night market, and it just hasn't happened yet. But Angela and I do agree with Angela. Now there's even more importance on the night market as we try to revitalize downtown and repopulate downtown. And having events like the night market, they're as important as ever to get people to come back to the central business district. So yeah, I think the night market has been a tremendous asset. And it's really kind of been a grassroots asset. I'm familiar with the Beerline Trail as well. and they're kind of very different in their genesis, but both have the same creative placemaking history.
Nice. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to travel back up to Mark and Kimberly. So this research, as you stated earlier, has been a part of this larger project. It focuses on 4 different cities. How are Milwaukee's creative placemaking practices different or similar to those other efforts?
Sure, I can start taking this. And I think this particular project, I feel that on some levels, it's complicated because I feel that for the project in New York City, it's in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is a neighborhood that has a host of economic challenges from poverty to just a lot of issues with community safety, is focused on an organization that actually works specifically with young people. So it's sort of like what they're focused on is literally looking at the sense of safety for young people so they can implement a creative placemaking initiative within the neighborhood in a way that brings people together. But also acknowledging that people from different parts of the neighborhood might feel comfortable or less comfortable in different parts of the neighborhood. But I feel it's the same kind of thing where the importance of really broad outreach and making sure that you're incorporating people who otherwise aren't necessarily, active or participating in these things is super, super important. So I think there's this commonality there. The Alameda Sheriff's Department is really interesting, and it's a very complicated space because Alameda, which is basically suburban Bay Area, San Francisco, is a sheriff's department that is part of an unincorporated part of the county of Alameda, California, which basically means there's not really any city government leading much of any initiative in that area. So the sheriff's department basically a few years ago decided, like, why don't we do it? So they tried to do kind of an event type thing, and in that way, the Eden Night Live had some similarities with, I think, maybe the night market, and attempt to basically get people around, activate a space that was seen as kind of unsafe or moribund. It was a big empty parking lot, and actually use that as a proof of concept for how the sheriff's department could actually play a role in engaging with the community more effectively. So there is, in there it was very explicitly a law enforcement engaged work in a very specific weird location because there weren't other city departments really doing that very actively. But I feel like, but they all kind of approach this from a way, basically the importance of outreach and getting diverse people, diverse sets of people like engaged in not only the activity or the event or the space, but the process is super, super important. And that's something I think we've seen more broadly in the creative placemaking world anyway. Like that has to be really important to make places and events really successful.
Great. Kimberly, do you want to add anything?
No, Mark is a little bit closer to those other 2 projects. The most I will say is one of the differences between this project and just the broader creative placemaking space is the amount of actors at the table. So I think each of these projects really differ based on who gets involved and who ends up being that champion. And what's really great and somewhat unique about this project is that there are multiple champions that bring different angles of the work together. And I think that that's actually one of the reasons why we've seen so much success in the night market and the Beerline, just being able to have all of these cooks that are bringing different points of interest to the project and really keeping that focus on equity and what the neighborhood wants.
Thank you. All right, so Angela, I'm coming back to you. As you talk about the Milwaukee Method of creative placemaking, we'd just like to know how you use that in your work, including in the night market.
Absolutely. I think the main takeaway for me related to the Milwaukee Method is that it really lives at the intersection of community and economic development, which is a little bit different than the classical sense of how creative placemaking is termed in an architectural way. And as everyone has sort of noted, brings a lot of people to the table. So I think about even the process with which we curated things like who would vend, how we involve the performers. In a traditional sort of festival planning, you have someone who just books musicians and that's the end of it. And we had a very intensive design and curatorial process that was a 2-way communication for each element of that, which I think is the true reason that we saw the diversity in the attendees, because those that were participating as vendors felt as if it was their market, that they were inviting their friends and family to come down and see them at. We actually had a bit of an issue with it, actually, when I think about it, because we would officially announce it via our website and on social media, and vendors would also launch their own events. So like I remember one year, one of the partner organizations, their Facebook event for it ended up having like tens of thousands of attendees, more than the official one, because people were so, you know what I mean, so enthusiastic and so excited to be there. And that element of it does take a lot more coordination, but I think is the real way you create an equitable space, because people all feel as though it's their place to be, rather than just having it be from the GMC or from Milwaukee, the way that some of the other sort of cultural activities are owned by a single organization and identified as that population's activity to go to.
That's good, thank you. And Daryl, I'm coming to you, and I actually have the same question about how you use the Milwaukee Method for placemaking and our work on the Beerline Trail.
Yeah, we've been heavily invested on the Beerline Trail, and I just want to call out a couple of projects that we have done and some future projects that we're looking at, because it's all tied back to really creating economic development opportunities, not only for residents, but for investors to come into the neighborhood. Those investors have to be really mindful of the community that they're coming in. We did what we call the Riverworks City Center. It's right next to the Beerline Trail, so it's the most of a commercial development. We also did a Riverworks Loft, where we took an old pasta factory and we turned it into 36 units of affordable housing. Then we also have 3 other projects which are on the table. One is really creating a public space for entertainment, what we call the Beerline Plaza. Then we also looking to do another housing development. We haven't come up with a name, but I just call it Riverworks Loft 2, which would be about 34 units of affordable housing. Then we also have the Connector project, which is right there. And that's sort of the hub for the Beerline Trail, creating a community space, but also having a small entrepreneur in front of the building. So what we have really kind of focused on is this lifeline, the trail, really bringing 2 neighborhoods together, River West and Harambe, but the resources and the effort is really being pushed by the Development Corporation in the bid district to incorporate all those ideals and all those thoughtful things to really revitalize these 2 neighborhoods.
Thank you, thank you. So we are coming up on time, but I do want to get to some of my last questions for Sam and John before I get us out of here. So please allow me some grace in doing that. Sam, that said, I'm coming over to you. So the Urban Institute's report is focused on embedding equity into placemaking. How is equity a part of the planning work at the city level?
Well, thanks, Rosalind. And I'll give the short version of that answer, because I heard your cue about speeding this up here. So I'll just touch on I think at the highest level, both Mayor Barrett and the Common Council have made it very clear to all departments, including the Department of City Development, that equity needs to be at the forefront of what we're doing. I mean, I'd like to think we've been doing that for some time, but especially over the last 2 years, that's certainly risen to the top. And both the Common Council and Mayoral have given some high-level guidance for us on how to do that. And I think ways that we at the department have prioritized equity is both through implementing racial equity analyses and kind of how we design and implement our own outreach and engagement efforts. And we could do a whole panel just on some changes we've made over the last year as a result of some of our racial equity analysis and wanting to break down barriers that have been identified to participation. Our colleagues in the Department of Public Works, who are leaders on the Beerline Trail initiative also, I know that this isn't exactly tied to Complete Streets, but the way that they've designed an entire framework around how we're analyzing, evaluating, and tracking our investments in safe streets and complete streets projects through an equity lens, and tracking where those investments are made, identifying effective before and after measures. They've been a real leader in that. And then many of our efforts around housing and anti-displacement dovetail exactly, aligned with a lot of the issues that the Urban Institute brought up earlier, as far as things that other cities have done that we can learn from. And I think we have been a little bit of a leader there in coming up with anti-displacement strategies that we would implement before the investments in the trail. And that's another kind of subject we do a whole panel on. So I'll just leave it at that, as to say I think it's at the center of what we do, and I'd love to continue to talk about that with our stakeholder partners in the future.
Yeah, that's great to hear, Sam. Thank you for that. And John, you are going to take us out. So Grave is connected uniquely to both of these projects. You did move your office we talked about to the Grant Avenue, and then you all actually helped us develop the equitable implementation plan, which makes sure that we are developing equitably on the Beerline Trail. What do you think the impact of creative placemaking is for these two areas of Milwaukee?
Well, I think Angela talked about it well. I think done properly, I think the creative placemaking can be a real catalyst for not only neighborhood development, but just neighborhood interaction. I think at the Beerline, that's a much more important aspect of it, is how do you get these, neighborhoods that are just separated by this imaginary line of Holton Street, but very, very different. If you look at the map, how do you get them to interact? And so it's the same downtown. Milwaukee brought their night market and brought a whole different group of people downtown. And Mark showed or discussed the number of people who live here now, but just within a couple of blocks from my office, there's a tremendous amount of residential development that wasn't there even a few years ago. So I think the creative placemaking that Milwaukee did made some people look at downtown, look at Westown particularly as a place to live. I think the Beerline development, in addition to fostering, offshoot development, ideally will provide an opportunity for these two neighborhoods to become one. And I think when properly done, as Angela talked about, we as planners and engineers and architects sometimes can get kind of siloed and just think, once again, if you build it, they would come. So I think the more intentional, or maybe just the more grassroots in a way of creative placemaking, I think can accomplish a lot more than just the physical attributes that are added.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with you. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Mark, Kimberly, Sam, Daryl, Angela, John. We appreciate you all for being our last folks in this Beerline series. This is an amazing opportunity to talk about creative placemaking and how we can work it and use it to make sure that we are developing equitably among all our neighborhoods, right? So we want to encourage participants, panelists who are here to keep engaging in conversation. If there are any questions from our attendees, please reach out to us. We want to hear your voices. We want to know what you think. We want to get you involved. That's the whole point around creative placemaking. Thank you to Urban Institute for this report. We will definitely look at it here at Riverworks and make sure that we're looking at these takeaways. Evaluation, I'm always an advocate for, because it tells you if you're really doing your work, right? If you're accomplishing the goals you set out to accomplish. So thank you. Again, thank you, Melissa Baxter, for putting all these together and working tirelessly to make sure we have great content. Thank you to all of our panelists that we've had across the series. And thank you to Riverworks and GMC for making this happen for all of us. I wish you all some good weather and a happy summer. You all have a good one.